So today we have the pleasure to have Roy Deans as our guest. So Roy is a postdoctoral researcher at Ruhr University in Bochum, in Germany. And Roy works at the intersection of philosophy, psychology, and psychiatry. He has published already a number of papers, several of which are dealing with the nature of the self. And that is one reason why I'm interested in Roy's work, given my own interest in notions like authenticity and identity, often the kind of personal identity philosophical debate, and also this more recent debate about what some have called a narrative identity. It's been influenced quite a lot by philosophers like Maria Schechtman, who, by the way, will be our guest. Just a very short ad here for this workshop next week on successful and unsuccessful remembering. So 3 days next week, I think. Monday, Tuesday, and Friday we'll have this workshop, and it will feature well-known speakers like Schechtman. Might be of interest to you. But back to Roy. He is also a former colleague and a co-author of our very own Chris McCarroll. So they work together on episodic memory. I think the phenomenology of episodic memory, and I understand they now have doing some work on authenticity and its relation to memory. So I've also been interested in topics at that intersection. So Roy's work is of strong interest and relevance to me. Today, Roy will talk to us about the notion of self-ambiguity, and his title is Self-Ambiguity, a Phenomenon Distinct from Alienation, Inauthenticity, and Ambivalence. So, looking forward to it. Roy, welcome to the seminar.
Yes, thank you, Alex.
Sorry, I just realized you have an updated title.
So thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to give a talk here. As you can see on the slide, I've changed the title a little bit, but in essence, it's the same. So I'm going to try to distinguish this concept of self-ambiguity from adjacent concepts like, indeed, authenticity and ambivalence. So I've changed it here into a question form, namely, is self-ambiguity a novel concept? And the answer is going to be yes, because I do think that this is something that is distinct from these other phenomena that I've mentioned. So as a way of introducing this idea, actually, I thought it would be best to just give you an example to sort of bring about the gist of what it is that I'm interested in. So the example that I'm going to show you is a relatively long quote from a study by sociologist David Karp in the 1990s. And so David Karp did qualitative research on so-called self-help groups for affective disorders. So probably the most famous self-help group is Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, in the United States. But there's other groups like this. So these are groups that people who have, in this case, affective disorders like depression or bipolar disease, where they get together and they discuss their illness, basically, and they discuss ways in which they're coping, and they try to support one another, etc. And so David Karp attended these meetings, and as a sociologist and anthropologist, he kind of wanted to investigate what happens. And one of the things that he remarks is the following. He says, it was quite common to hear people talk about the fact that when they were overly aggressive, acting out, irritable, and so on, it was the illness talking and not them. One woman whose husband was a manic depressive said that sometimes it's not clear whether the illness is talking or whether he is talking. In a different meeting, a woman who described a history of beginning to take college courses only to drop out offered the following analysis of her behavior. I would always start courses and then drop out. I used to think that I was easily bored, but now I don't blame myself or the class because it's not me or the class, it's the illness. Yet another woman who was undecided about returning to work as a preschool teacher wondered out loud, do I not want to go back to it, or is it because of the illness that I don't want to return? And finally, another participant added, I'm trying to discover my basic personality aside from the disease. That's why I'm at these meetings, to discover which is which. So as a very sort of basic definition, we can see that self-ambiguity, or in this case, self-illness ambiguity, has to do with the ambiguous relation between the self or identity or who a person is on the one hand, and their illness or their mental disorder on the other hand. So this phenomenon has been studied. Actually, it hasn't received that much attention, which I always find very surprising. So it basically started in the 1990s when David Karp, so the researcher that I just cited from, he did some qualitative research on these patients and self-help groups. And there are a couple of other people, and David Karp coined this term illness ambiguity to refer to this phenomenon that he kept on noticing, that people have trouble relating to their illness in an appropriate way. And interestingly, it didn't really get picked up that much, even in anthropology and sociology, where David Karp is writing from. This hasn't really been that much, hasn't really had that much of an impact. And then in 2007, psychiatrist John Sadler wrote a philosophical paper where he coined the term self-illness ambiguity. And so he draws on the work of Karp, but he makes more explicit that what is at stake is not just the illness itself, but the relation between the self and the illness. And then in my own PhD thesis in 2020, I argued that self-illness ambiguity can be understood as a form of what I call self-ambiguity. So one of the main claims that I make is that where people can have trouble relating to an illness, they can also have trouble relating to a bunch of other stuff. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today as well. So the question that I posed is, is self-ambiguity novel? And the whole point here is going to be that the concept is new, but that the phenomenon isn't, meaning that people have been, having had trouble with relating to their illness, for instance, as long as psychiatric diagnoses exist, probably. But the whole point is that this concept itself has not been used. And it's important that it does get used because it enables us to do two things. First of all, it enables us to open up a new domain of research, namely to look specifically at these types of cases that are currently often neglected. But it also allows for a kind of reinterpretation of existing research, because one of the claims that I will be defending here today is that actually there might already be quite some research on self-ambiguity, but under a different guise. So I think that some research that is supposedly about alienation or inauthenticity is actually meant to be about self-ambiguity. In other words, because we don't really have this concept figured out yet, we fail to appropriately investigate these complex phenomena. So the job for me then is to delineate this concept and to clarify how it is indeed unique and distinct from these other adjacent concepts. So what I've been trying to do is a couple of things. So of course I've been writing about this myself, but I'm also very happy with the fact that that I was invited to co-edit actually a double special issue on self-illness ambiguity in the journal Philosophical Explorations. So we actually have a bunch of papers that have already been published or that are forthcoming. So I'm really excited to see that many other philosophers are also, investigating this topic, and so it seems to be gaining more traction. And so what we see in the special issues is that there's several research teams that are being investigated, including the elements and the mechanisms of self-illness ambiguity. So what exactly is it, and how does it come about? How can it be resolved? Secondly, the clinical and ethical implications, because clearly this has to do also with how a therapy can best be organized, and it has ethical implications, for instance, with respect to responsibility. Then we see different accounts investigating self-illness ambiguity in different disorders. So, relating to autism might be different than relating to depression, for instance. And finally, we see that there is this idea that we might investigate different kinds of self-ambiguity. So most of the research, I would say, including most of what I will be talking about today, is about self-illness ambiguity. That is relating yourself to an illness. But there's also arguably other kinds of self-ambiguity, such as self-medication ambiguity, where you have to relate to the medication that you take or the effects of that medication, or self-implant ambiguity, where you have to relate to the fact that you might have a neurosurgical implant in your brain because of some psychiatric treatment, for instance. Now, what is also crucial is that this idea of self-ambiguity, right? So I've argued that this is something that is a more overarching concept in respect to these more specific cases of self-illness or self-medication ambiguity. But as this overarching concept or as an investigative framework, it still has to be elucidated. So this is something that Maria Schechman wrote in one of her commentaries to the papers in the special issue. And I think she's absolutely right, because what we see is that the terminology is still a bit vague in the sense that people use terms interchangeably, which perhaps shouldn't be used interchangeably, right? So people talk about things like self-ambiguity and self-illness ambiguity as if they're the same thing, but arguably they aren't. And the same goes for self-ambiguity and notions like alienation, ambivalence, and authenticity, which again, they might turn out to be similar, but they also might turn out to be different. And so what remains to be done is clarifying how they would be different and how they would be similar. So here's the outline for what I want to do in this talk. I think I've packed a lot of things in this talk, so I hope you'll bear with me, and if at any point things are a bit unclear, don't hesitate to ask any questions for clarification. So I'm going to start in the first section by introducing a distinction between what I call identity-related and agential self-ambiguity. And this is going to be very important for the remainder of the talk, because I think that the first one, identity-related self-ambiguity, is something that is maybe less complex and maybe more simple, and is also something that has already been investigated quite extensively. Whereas agential self-ambiguity is something that actually has been neglected, really. So in the second section, I'm going to offer somewhat of an explanation, bordering on speculation, actually, for why this agential self-ambiguity has been neglected. So how is it possible that there is this phenomenon that actually has quite some importance in clinical contexts, which hasn't really been investigated yet? How is that possible? Then in the third section, I'm going to talk, basically, put forward an account of agential self-ambiguity to clarify what it is. And then in the last section, I will say a little bit about how I think this is novel. In other words, how it is distinct from these other phenomena like alienation, inauthenticity, and ambivalence. Okay, so to start, here's the basic definition that I think is crucial before we continue. So identity-related self-ambiguity is the relation between your identity, basically, and something, namely X. So how do I relate to X? And then agential self-ambiguity is a slightly different question, namely, is it me or X that makes me do, feel, or think a certain action A? So I'm going to be talking about actions in a very broad sense, as including thoughts and feelings, and I will elaborate on that later. So you can see quite easily that these are similar, but they're distinct as well. So I will spend some time in this section explaining the differences and the similarities. But before that, I want to emphasize that what the variable X here in these questions is something that can be various, as I've argued in a recent paper. In other words, a lot of research has been on self-illness ambiguity, where the X is an illness. So how do I relate to my depression, or how do I relate to my autism? However, I think that that there's a bunch of things that can lead to ambiguity in this sense. And these range from extremely trivial everyday examples to more severe psychiatric contexts. So as an example of this basic trivial context, imagine that according to some candy bar commercial, you're not yourself when you're hungry. So the idea here is that if you are hungry, so there's a lack of nutrients in your body, you might act differently and you might feel differently, etc. And in some cases, it's immediately clear to you that you're hungry, and that's the reason why you're a bit annoyed or why you're feeling a certain way. But it's not always clear whether that's the case, right? You might know this from personal experience, that sometimes someone else actually has to tell you that the way that you're acting might be because of the fact that you're hungry. Now, what we argue in the paper is that this kind of what you could call self-hunger ambiguity is, of course, extremely simple and trivial. And it's simple in the sense that you know what the cause is, namely a lack of nutrients, and you know what the solution is, namely you have to eat something. So normally, if this kind of self-hunger ambiguity occurs at all, it never really poses a problem. And I think that's why we kind of don't pay attention to this. But the thing is that the X here, so the thing that you have trouble with, can also be something more significant. And I think that, let's say, somewhere halfway through the spectrum, we find things like life events. So, losing a loved one, becoming a parent, retiring from your job, getting a new job, all of these things similarly might make it difficult for you to relate to yourself and to your environment in a certain way. So there is some interesting work done on people who, get divorced or end long relationships, and the way that they talk about themselves is extremely similar to the context of self-illness ambiguity, for instance. So people always struggle, to determine why it is that they do certain things. So let's say that someone has been going to the same restaurant for decades together with their partner, but then they get divorced, and now they're no longer sure whether they actually want to go to that restaurant or whether they've always went to that restaurant because their partner wanted to. However, I think that the most interesting cases and the most complex cases of self-ambiguity occur in psychiatric contexts. So here's a book by David Karp called Is It Me or My Meds?, which focuses on people struggling with basically self-medication ambiguity. So, having trouble with determining whether their actions are their own actions or whether they are due to their medication. Another example is from the debate on deep brain stimulation that I will return to in a few slides as well, where people wonder whether it's their brain implant that made them do certain things. You can also talk about more generally the impact of the brain, right? So we know that the brain is highly complex, and we often struggle to relate to the brain in an appropriate way, right? Is the brain something that is different from who you are? Is the brain the boss of you, or are you the boss of your brain? All of that, of course, depends also on how you conceptualize yourself and how you think the brain operates. Now, I think that these things also illustrate why self-ambiguity in the context of psychiatry is so complex, because, as I said, in the case of self-hunger ambiguity, the cause is very simple, namely a lack of nutrients. The solution is very simple, namely you have to eat something. But in the case of self-illness ambiguity, both the cause and the solution are extremely difficult. So you don't really know why you're depressed. It could be because of something that happened in your childhood. It could be because of stress at work. It could be because of some a deficit in a certain neurotransmitter, it's likely a combination of all of those. And also with respect to solving this, not every treatment works. Not every treatment works directly. It often takes time, etc. So resolving something like self-illness ambiguity is much more complex than these trivial forms of self-ambiguity. Okay, so let me say a little bit more about how I think these two forms of self-ambiguity are related and different. So the main way in which they're similar is quite obvious, namely, they're both about relations, and that these relations can be ambiguous. That's actually the main reason for grouping these together. Now, the differences have to do with the following, at least with the following three respects. So the first one is that the relations at stake are either between two elements or three elements. So in the case of identity-related self-ambiguity, the two elements are just you and the illness in the case of self-illness ambiguity. So like I said, I will be mainly talking about self-illness ambiguity, but I think that, as I said in the previous slide, it's not restricted to cases of illness. But it just makes it more easy to talk about a concrete thing like an illness, or a relatively concrete thing like an illness, I should say. So in the case of an illness, the question with identity-related self-ambiguity is, how do I relate to my illness? Whereas in the case of agential self-ambiguity, the question is, does the feeling that I have now, or the action that I did, should I see that as something that I did, or should I see that as something that is due to my autism or my depression? So the elements that are involved seem to differ here. Now, the second difference has to do with a distinction that I've made in earlier work about different levels. So the idea here is that you can deal with self-ambiguity on what I call the conceptual reflective level and the phenomenological unreflective level. So on the conceptual reflective level, this basically means that you more or less consciously think about these questions, right? So you could say, you're sitting in an armchair and you think about how you relate to your illness, or you sit in your armchair and you contemplate, why you lashed out on your partner, and whether that is because, whether you should attribute that to yourself, or whether you should sort of attribute that to your illness. Whereas in phenomenological or unreflective self-ambiguity on that level, there is not necessarily a kind of conscious reflection on what you're doing, but these questions kind of operate in the background. Now, of course, someone can ask you about these things, and then it becomes more of a reflective thing. But in a lot of cases, it operates in the background, in a sense that in your actions, it's not clear to you how you relate to your illness, or that it's not clear to you whether the thing that you're doing should be attributed to the illness or not. Now, this distinction enables us to see, again, a difference between these two forms of self-ambiguity, namely that identity-related self-ambiguity tends to be conceptual reflective, meaning that people often consciously think about their relation to their illness. They might do that in discussions with other people. They might write in their diary about how they think about their illness, etc. Now, agential self-ambiguity, in contrast, is something that often occurs on the phenomenological level. So this uncertainty about whether it's you or the illness that makes you do a certain thing is something that occurs on the unreflective level. But it can also occur on a conceptual level, right? So as I previously said, you can always also consciously think about this. You can also discuss this with other people. Now, the reason why I distinguish these two levels is important for two other reasons as well. First of all, because it enables us to understand the mechanisms and dynamics of agential self-ambiguity. I will return to this later. And second, that it helps us to investigate the fact that we can have self-ambiguity both from a first person as well as from a third person perspective. In other words, I myself can struggle to relate to an illness, or can struggle to determine whether it was me or the illness that made me do something. But it can also be someone else, right? So my partner can think this as well. My doctor can think about this, etc. I will say something more about this later on as well. Now, the third main difference has to do with contextualization, as I call it. So because of the involvement of this action A in agential self-ambiguity, this form, so the agential form of self-ambiguity, is highly contextualized, meaning that it is something that occurs when the agent is immersed in goal-directed action with particular social, material, and temporal circumstances. In contrast to identity-related self-ambiguity, which is more detached, right? So as I previously said, you can contemplate your relation to the illness while sitting in an armchair. So whilst not doing anything else, but seeing this as more of a theoretical question that you're trying to answer. Now, the sort of elephant in the room, of course, is that these two forms of self-ambiguity are also related in various ways. And the reason for that is quite obvious, namely that agency is also related to identity. Now, there is various accounts of how agency is related to identity, and I'm not going to go into detail about those. But one very obvious way of construing this relation is to say that for a lot of people, their identity is made up of the things that they do, or the things that they have done, or the things that they plan to do. And I think that's an obvious way in which agency and identity are interrelated, and also why identity-related self-ambiguity might be related to agential self-ambiguity and vice versa. Okay, so if we have this distinction, that we can look at, well, is there any existing research on these topics? And then we see that there is at least some research on identity-related self-illness ambiguity, meaning that there is research that has explicitly targeted the way in which people relate to their illness. So we can look at, for instance, illness identity research, or research on how people accommodate a certain diagnostic label into their self-image or self-narrative. First of all, this research is still relatively sparse, but also I think that it often fails to accommodate precisely the ambiguity at stake. So they tend to focus on, let's say, the successful cases of establishing an illness identity, but they leave out the cases where the ambiguity remains. Then if we look at agential self-illness ambiguity, we see that there's actually hardly any research on this. So some of the pioneering research from the 1990s that I mentioned in the beginning is probably an exception here. One explanation I have for this, but this is very speculative again, is that that it has to just do with the way in which people conduct research. Namely, as a researcher, you want things to be measurable, you want things to be clear, and cases of self-ambiguity, it's in the name almost, are ambiguous. They're difficult to measure. They kind of fall in between existing categories. And I think that's one of the, my intuition is that is one of the reasons why people haven't really been investigating these in the past couple of decades. So I think that these distinctions that I've made can also be useful in kind of reinterpreting existing discussions. So one of those is the debate on deep brain stimulation that I know at least Alex is interested in and has worked on. So what you could call cases of self-DBS ambiguity involve cases where people receive deep brain stimulation treatment, meaning that an implant with electrodes is implanted into the brain, specific regions depending on specific illnesses, and then your brain is basically artificially stimulated to reduce certain symptoms. Well, what research has found is that in at least a certain percentage of patients, they make reports along the lines of, I don't feel like myself anymore, since I've had this deep brain stimulation, I struggle to find myself again. I'm no longer the same person, etc., etc. And so philosophers and neuroethicists have then tried to make sense of these reports. Like, what do these patients mean when they say that they're no longer the same person? And what we see is that there is actually quite some diversity, but roughly you can see that some accounts are more geared towards identity and other ones are more based towards agency. So Maria Schechtman, in a very early paper on this, basically said that the problem is that the self-narrative of the patients prior to the deep brain stimulation is so radically different than the possible narrative that they can develop after the deep brain stimulation, that the problem that they have is that they have to integrate these radically different narratives. And that's where the reports come from. Now, later on, others have emphasized more the agency component, namely that patients struggle to determine whether the choices that they're making, for instance, are their own choices, or whether they should be seen as being the result of the deep brain stimulation treatment. Now, more generally, what we see in this debate is that there is the lack of a good framework to delineate between these different issues, such as authenticity, autonomy, and so forth. And I think that the project that I'm undertaking concerning self-ambiguity fits in there quite nicely, because I think that it offers some clarity with respect to the possible problems that are at play. Okay, so why has agential self-ambiguity been neglected? So why haven't people been investigating this? So first of all, it's important to notice that the question at stake here is basically how an action, namely A, relates to the agent, right? So the main criticism that I have is actually quite simple, namely that the vast majority of research in philosophy and psychology that deals with this complex question operates within a dichotomous framework. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to really quickly go through basically this enormous literature, and I'm not at all going to do justice to the complexity of each of those accounts, but that's also not the goal. The goal here is mainly to show that they have this dichotomous framework consisting of just two options, and I think that that's where the problem originates. So in philosophy, the best example of this is the work of Harry Frankfurt, meaning that I'm criticizing Harry Frankfurt, but I'm basically also criticizing, let's say, the entire debate that works within this framework that Frankfurt has set up. So Frankfurt talks about what he calls the moving principle over actions in his analysis of agency. So this is quite literally that which moves us. And he says that this can be either internal or external to ourselves. And this is where the dichotomy comes up, right? So there's only two options, according to Frankfurt, namely that an action is felt as internal or as external to yourself. So an action with an external moving principle is something like a spasm or a tantrum. And he gives the following example of someone who has a tantrum and then says, the feelings just came over me from out of nowhere and I couldn't help it. I wasn't myself, right? So even though this was clearly the person who, got angry and shouted or whatever, the person says, well, it didn't feel like it was me doing that. It felt like something external was making me do that. In contrast, an internal moving principle is a moving principle that someone has identified with or that one acts on wholeheartedly. So Frankfurt has a quite complex account of how this works. But again, for present purposes, the only thing that matters is that he makes this distinction between moving principles being either internal or external. Then what we see in psychology is something similar. So in motivational psychology, for instance, we have things like the following. So people talk about the perceived locus of causal intentionality. Again, that which makes you do something, which can be either internal or external to the self. And self-determination theory, which is this ridiculously influential theory from psychology, meaning that the theory itself is not ridiculous. It's a very good theory, but the impact that this theory has is just amazing. But it posits that human motivation is driven by either intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, right? So this is something that actually became also part of public vocabulary, if you will, right? So the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is also used quite a lot in education, where you have to make sure that students are intrinsically motivated because that way they learn more, etc. But again, for present purposes, what mainly is relevant here is the fact that there is two options, intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. We see this dichotomy also coming back in, for instance, research on self-efficacy, personality psychology, and in work on the sense of agency. Now, I think, but again, this is speculation, that this tendency for dichotomous thinking has to do with the kind of Cartesian intuitions that operate in the background. So on the one hand, because I think that a lot of researchers, especially someone like Harry Frankfurt, tends to conflate the self with a conscious or rational agent, and thereby downplaying other elements of what you could call the self, namely unreflective agency or things like embodiment. They're seen as something that are more in the realm of externality, basically. And on the other hand, we see that there is a Cartesian intuition in requiring a sharp distinction between subject and object, meaning that something either originates in oneself or not. So there was an interesting study by Louis Sass, who's a clinical psychologist, and he has a paper on, the paper itself is actually about schizophrenia mainly, but in preparation for that paper, he investigated conceptualizations of illness from the ancient Greeks until now. And so basically in 2000 years, there have only been two options for conceptualizing an illness. Namely, an illness is either something that comes from outside, like when a virus enters your body, or it's something that emerges from within, for instance, because of some genetic makeup. So we find this idea that, you know, something comes from the outside is extrinsic, external, or it is internal or intrinsic. It's really a very commonplace thought. Now, here's the main point. Ontologically speaking, so in a kind of Cartesian ontology, the moving principle, or however you want to call it, is indeed internal or external. There is no other option. But phenomenologically, there is more to our experiences. It might be unclear to us on an experiential level whether an action is internal or external, and those constitute cases of agential self-ambiguity. In other words, what research up until now has been neglecting is this possibility that our experiences do not match that which is ontologically possible. So phenomenologically, there is more to this. And we see this in a lot of the qualitative studies on how people deal with illnesses, for instance. But those are not really picked up in the dichotomous frameworks that I've been mentioning. And notice that I'm, to some extent, just positing this. And I think that the burden of proof actually lies with these dichotomous frameworks. So I think that those frameworks have a pretty tough job in explaining how these kind of experiences of what I've called self-ambiguity could be accommodated within that dichotomy. Okay. So then let's continue with saying a little bit more about what agential phenomenology might entail. So the working definition that I've put out here is that agential self-ambiguity pertains to instances where a person is unclear whether an action or an invitation for action, thought or feeling, originates in themselves or should rather be attributed to X, where X again can be this variation of things, but mainly I will be talking about an illness. And in the next few slides, I will basically be dissecting this definition and saying something about the different phrasings or concepts that are in there. So notice, first of all, that we still have to keep in mind this distinction between the phenomenological unreflective level and the conceptual reflective level. So most of our everyday lives are filled with experiences of internality and externality. So that's something that I maybe should emphasize a little bit further, which is that the research that I've just mentioned, so the research by Harry Frankfurt on agency and the stuff from motivational psychology, I'm not arguing against that. So I think that they did a really terrific job at explaining, let's say, 99% of our daily experiences. What I'm criticizing them for is that they left out these cases in which the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic is not sufficient. So just like cases of internality and externality, so too with cases of self-ambiguity, we feel these things primarily in our lived body and in our embodied interactions with the environment. So there are experiences of the moving principle, of the source of action, if you will, but sometimes they involve experiences of unclarity, of vagueness, of something being not right, and these are typically noticed. And they're noticed because they're not our default way of experiencing ourselves or the world. So assuming that, let's just stick to the 99%, assuming that 99% of our experiences in our daily life consists of cases of internality or externality, then these cases of self-ambiguity are exceptional in that respect. And that means that they're typically noticed. They are more in the foreground of our experience than in the background of our experience. And if they are sufficiently noticed, so if we actually pay attention to them, if we stop acting and reflect on them, then we basically switch to the conceptual level. And in those cases, we might actually utter phrases like, is it me or my illness that is making me do this? Now, on the conceptual level, we also engage with conceptual problems. So I've outlined a couple of those in a paper with a psychiatrist. So to just give one example, is the issue of reification that philosophers are often interested in. So if you think about your illness in a reified manner, so if you think that your depression is a thing, then the question of whether it is you or the depression that made you do something becomes an actual question, right? So in other words, it's actually a flawed conception of the depression that gives rise to that question in the first place. Because, of course, depression isn't a thing that is making you do something. Actually, depression is just a cluster of symptoms. So if you're wondering whether it is the depression that is making you sleep, sleep in all day, then that's actually a misportrayal. The fact that you sleep, the fact that you have a different sleeping schedule than you would normally have, together with some other symptoms, that simply is the depression. So the depression is not something that causes that, it's something else. So I've thought about how I should illustrate the difference between these two levels. So this is kind of an attempt. I'm not sure if this brings across the point correctly, but I was thinking about these example of these sketches from Escher about impossible environments, right? So I'm assuming that some of you are familiar with these kinds of images. And so if you take a quick glance at this, then there is an immediate sense that can only be described as something being not right. And this feeling occurs on a phenomenological or unreflective level. It's an immediate awareness that something is off, and this awareness often reverberates throughout one's body. In Escher's Impossible Staircases, for instance, one feels in one's body that those staircases would be impossible to interact with. If one continues to pay attention to the artwork, then one may become consciously aware of the paradoxical depiction of the impossible object. And as the brain tries to make sense of the image without success, a more reflective sense that something is not right lingers. So the feeling that something is wrong when you look at these staircases is something that can occur both in a way that it doesn't really that it isn't attended to consciously, but it can also, of course, be on the center of your attention so that you do consciously think about it. But often it doesn't take away the sense of disease or the sense that there is something wrong here. That remains. And that's why the images, the artwork is so interesting. So here I have some further examples of cases of self-ambiguity, and I've included these for two reasons. On the one hand, because I think it's good to make things a little bit more concrete again, and on the other hand, I think it's helpful to see why I think that we should have a broad construal of actions. Because, for instance, the work of Harry Frankfurt focuses mainly on what he calls moving principles or passions, so basically short-term precursors to action. And I think that it makes sense to also talk about actions very broadly, so including more diachronic actions, but also things like feelings and emotions. So here's a couple of examples that I took from various sources, basically. So one example is, so this is from a patient that I encountered during my own PhD research. So this was a woman who at some point decided that she didn't want to, that she didn't go to a birthday party. And so instead she just lay on the couch at home. But then she wasn't really sure whether, why she stayed at home. So is this something that was a kind of autonomous decision for herself, that she actually just wanted to, peace and quiet, so she decided to stay at home? But she wasn't sure about that because she was diagnosed with bipolar disease, and she wondered whether maybe the fact that she want to go to the party or the fact that she actually decided to stay at home was indicative of the fact that she was becoming depressed again. And the whole thing here is that she didn't know, right? So that's the ambiguity itself. There isn't a way of testing, of, keeping score of something and then finding out, oh, it was me, or oh, it was the illness. That's the whole point. It's ambiguous. Now, another example is something like choosing certain career paths. So we can easily imagine that there is someone who becomes a doctor because, since childhood, they've been interested in helping people, curing people. They're fascinated by the human body, in which case it would be a clearly intrinsic motivation or an intrinsic moving principle that made them choose this career path and actually manage to accomplish this. And we can also imagine cases that are clearly extrinsic or external, where someone has been forced by their parents or because of peer pressure to undertake a certain career path. But then it seems also quite obvious that there might be cases in between where someone has decided to become a doctor, but they're not really sure whether they've done that because they really wanted to, or maybe there was a different reason, namely that they wanted to live up to the standards of their parents, something along those lines, right? This is something that you often find in therapeutic contexts where people kind of revisit their own life and their own life story, and they come to question their motives. And this is precisely when the ambiguity emerges. Now, a final example comes from anthropological work on what is called emotional labor. So emotional labor involves situations where people have to display certain emotions, often as part of their job requirement. So the pioneering study on this was on airline stewardesses, right? So if you're on an airplane, then the people handing out the tea and the coffee, they're always smiling. And they're not always smiling because they're always happy, but they're always smiling because they have to be kind to you as a customer. And so what these studies found was that these women, there were often women back then, eventually ended up having difficulty in determining whether their smiles, their happiness basically, was their own or whether it was because of their job. So these people would be, coming home from work, during the weekends, they would be at home, and they would experience happiness, or they would find themselves smiling, but they would not be sure of whether they would actually be happy, or whether it's just the result of having been obliged to smile at work all of the week. Okay, so the fact that we have this distinction between these two levels also means that this idea that, so this is this part of the definition, that a thought, feeling, or action originates in self or should be attributed to X, that we can fill this in either in terms of a more reflective evaluation, in the case of self-ambiguity on a conceptual level, but it can also be a more automatic and implicit appraisal in the case of self-ambiguity on a phenomenological level. As I've already mentioned previously, these things can also occur from both a third-person and first-person perspective. So there are some interesting studies being done on where people have to determine whether a specific case study, often by means of a vignette, whether a person is just sad or whether this person is depressed. So they read a little story about a person, and then they have to determine whether this person is sad or depressed. Or they have to read a story about someone or watch a video of someone and then have to determine whether this person is just a very perfectionist individual or whether this person has obsessive compulsive disorder. And the whole thing is, of course, that this is very difficult, and that clinicians and therapists have training to make these kinds of determinations, but lay people don't. But lay people still try to resolve these questions. So self-ambiguity from a third-person perspective may occur both with respect to agential as well as identity-related self-ambiguity, because another person may struggle to determine whether a particular action is yours or due to your illness, but they may also struggle to determine how you relate to your illness. So both options are available. Now, regarding the dynamics and mechanisms, so how does self-ambiguity emerge and how can it be resolved? I've argued that this has to do mainly with the interaction between how someone thinks about themselves reflectively, and that this may impact how one experiences oneself unreflectively and vice versa. And this plays a role both in how agential self-ambiguity emerges, but also in how it may be resolved. Specifically, the idea is that self-ambiguity emerges when there is a lack of coherence among how one thinks about oneself and how one experiences oneself. And self-ambiguity can thus be reduced by increasing the coherence. And of course, these are very complex processes, so they have to be scrutinized more closely. But in a few papers, we've tried to clarify this at least a little bit. So in the definition, I also included so-called invitations to act, right? So it's not just that people might struggle to determine whether a certain action is theirs or because of their illness. It also concerns possibilities for action. And I argue that these can also be felt as either intrinsic, extrinsic, as well as ambiguous. So the example that I thought about was the possibility for action that is offered when someone extends their hand. So if someone walks up to you like this and they extend their hand, then you probably feel you immediately experience not only that there's a possibility for shaking the hand, but also that you're probably inclined to do that. You feel solicited or drawn to actually engage with that action. Now, in a lot of cases, that might be intrinsic, right? So this might be a friend of yours, so you want to shake their hand. It might be extrinsic, as when a parent tells their child that they have to shake someone else's hand. But they can also be ambiguous. And I was thinking about this example, and I realized that this is something that I think is very often portrayed in movies, in films. So there is often in movies this situation where someone has to make a deal, right? And it's often a kind of deal where they have to make this deal to save some innocent lives or something along those lines, but they have to give something else up as well. So what you often see in these movies is these scenarios where some protagonist of the film has to shake someone's hand, but they hesitate. And I would argue that these moments of hesitation indicate precisely the ambiguity at stake, where they're not really sure experientially whether what they're doing is intrinsic or extrinsic, and that the hesitation is symptomatic of that. So the reason why I included this in the definition is because this helps to explain the dynamics of self-ambiguity. So this is something that I've worked on myself, but for instance, Michel Maillé also recently wrote about this, showing that possibilities for action, in other words, affordances, can help to explain how people experience self-ambiguity and how they might try to resolve this. Okay, so selves and persons. So I include both the term self and the term person in the definition. And so I talk about the individual struggling with self-ambiguity as a person, because this is not merely a biological entity or a cognitive system, but also a moral agent, someone who has hopes and dreams, who aims at a certain degree of self-understanding, and who faces self-ambiguity as a challenge in that. So we talk about the individual who is dealing with self-ambiguity, and to label this as a person seems indicative of the most respect. Now, this is somewhat straightforward, but I think the most interesting stuff is this, that the person in the ambiguity, so to speak, is what we could call a self. And it has to do really with how a person understands themselves, or a bit, artificially, how they understand their self. Now, this has very important implications, because this means that we are focusing on the level of lay theories, how lay people think about themselves. And what we know from research is that lay theories are extremely diverse. Not only that, they're often, very problematic in the sense that they are incoherent or sometimes incompatible, they're full of paradoxes, etc. But I also think that it's important that these are not metaphysical statements. So it doesn't make sense for philosophers to say, well, that's a wrong conception of the self, because that is usually not what's at stake. So philosophers come up with metaphysical theories about the self, but lay people are often not interested in metaphysical theories. However, if we want to study self-ambiguity, so from a third-person perspective, then I've argued that a multidimensional account of the self is preferred, meaning that we shouldn't conflate the self with something like consciousness or reflection, as Frankfurt and others have done. Because if we do that, then we are likely to miss out on certain elements of self-ambiguity, or that we have a limited way of understanding the dynamics of self-ambiguity. Okay, so here's the last part of the talk, where I want to argue that self-ambiguity, as I've been talking about it so far, so mainly agential self-ambiguity, is novel. And I'm going to distinguish it from these other phenomena, namely ambivalence, inauthenticity, and alienation. And one final point is that I want to say that I think that it's likely that some of the research on alienation and ambivalence is actually about self-ambiguity. And so I will end with a small remark about the distinction between the process of, I'll make a remark about process versus outcome. Okay, so ambivalence is probably the phenomenon that philosophers are most likely to think about when they first hear about self-ambiguity. Ambivalence is a notion that is central to the work of Harry Frankfurt that I've already mentioned. And so it should come as no surprise that the main criticism here is that ambivalence has to do with this dichotomy that I've been criticizing. So Harry Frankfurt is interested in these types of cases. So in scenario A, an agent has one internal moving principle and one external moving principle. And there is no conflict here because the agent can simply just act on the internal moving principle and everything is fine. Now in scenario B, an agent has two internal moving principles, which are incompatible. So the agent is being pulled in two opposite directions and so cannot act wholeheartedly, because acting on one of those internal moving principles would mean not acting in accordance with the other internal moving principle. So this is what Frankfurt, in a nutshell, calls cases of ambivalence, where there's two internal moving principles, but they're pulling you in opposite directions, so to speak. And as I said, these are working within this dichotomous framework, and that's what I want to step away from. So here's another scenario where an agent has one internal moving principle and one ambiguous moving principle. So for instance, the internal moving principle is a reflectively endorsed value and makes this person want to go left, but there's another moving principle that makes her want to go right. However, she's in a state of agential self-ambiguity. She doesn't know whether the moving principle that makes her want to go right is hers, in which case it would be an internal moving principle and the situation turns into a case of ambivalence, or whether it's actually her antidepressant medication, which makes her want to go to right, in which case it might be an external moving principle, depending on how she relates to her illness. So I'm not necessarily interested here in solving these cases at this point. I'm mainly pointing out that this is something that happens in clinical contexts and that these are not appropriately accommodated in the dichotomous framework of Frankfurt. So here's an even more complex scenario where an agent has an external moving principle and an ambiguous moving principle. So in most cases, it seems that the reasonable option is to act on the ambiguous moving principle because it may very well turn out to be an internal moving principle in retrospect. But there's an interesting but arguably rare way of complicating this, which involves the idea of degrees of internality and externality. So imagine that this pertains to the same individual from the previous scenario, and the issue at hand is whether to start a new behavioral therapy alongside her antidepressant medication. So her doctor suggests that she does. And suppose that we could quantify the degrees of internality and externality, where 10 is fully internal and 1 is fully external. And let's say that in this case, the degree of externality of the doctor's advice as a moving principle is 7, meaning that the patient has a good relationship with her doctor, but at the same time worries that the doctor does not always take her seriously. So it's not fully internal, which it would be if the relationship with the doctor would be, perfect and she would trust the doctor completely. Now, concerning the ambiguous moving principle, one option is that in retrospect, it turns out to be an internal moving principle. And in that case, it would have been good, again, in retrospect, to act on the ambiguous moving principle because it would have turned out to be internal. But another option is that it turns out to be a moving principle with an externality degree that is lower than the externality degree of the doctor's advice. For instance, the patient would really hate herself if it turns out that she made a particular choice because of her antidepressant medication. Again, I'm not so much at this point interested in solving these cases. It's just that these cases exist and they are not accommodated by the dichotomous frameworks. And so in a recent other paper, I briefly elaborated on the implications that cases of self-ambiguity have for clinical decision-making, and specifically the fact that patients struggling with ambivalence have to be approached or have to be helped in a different way than people struggling with self-ambiguity. Okay, so then authenticity, or actually, it's more likely that self-ambiguity has to do with inauthenticity. So I would say that the majority of philosophical and psychological research has investigated authenticity as a more detached phenomenon, where the thing that is authentic is something like the person as a whole, or their life as a whole, or their traits. And this has recently been called trait authenticity. Now, to some extent, we can link this to identity-related self-ambiguity, right? So if someone has an illness or they're diagnosed with something like autism, and they have to then decide whether they are an authentic person, then it's probable that they also have to take into account their relation to their autism. Now, I think that in most of the research here, again, the ambiguity itself is typically not acknowledged. But no, that doesn't mean that this is really something completely different than trait inauthenticity. Now, state authenticity is another form of authenticity that has been the topic of interest in the past, I would say, 5 years or so. So here, authenticity is conceptualized as a highly contextualized phenomenon, where one experiences in their everyday life whether what they are doing is in line with their true self. So research on this tries to find in which contexts or in which, during which actions people feel like they are themselves, whether they are expressing their true self, for instance. Now, there is a potential link here to agential self-ambiguity in the sense that there is, that it is conceptualized as being much more an immersive experience and something that people experience in their everyday agency. However, again, I think that the problem here is that in the background, there seems to be this dichotomous framework on the lure again. In other words, people seem to be interested in whether or not an action is in line with their true self. But those two options, again, I don't think that they exhaust everyday human experience. Then turning to alienation. Again, alienation is sometimes seen as this more detached phenomenon. So Alan Koster in a recent paper says that while alienation is often framed as a more free-floating state of feeling detached from broader life domains, self-ambiguity seems to be framed as referring to more local and contextualized experiences with a particular domain of the individual's life. So this could be already one way in which we could distinguish alienation from self-ambiguity. However, it seems that there is also cases where alienation is more contextualized, where it's not just that one feels alien as such, but that it's a specific action or a specific person that one feels alienated from, in which case it is more contextualized. Now, in those cases, there's a couple of ways in which we can see this relation. The first one is to say that alienation is simply a component of self-ambiguity, right? So in the cases of self-ambiguity that we've been discussing, there certainly seems to be a kind of uncomfortable element, right? So when people experience self-ambiguity, this typically is something that they dislike. There is a kind of dis-ease. They want to get rid of it. And one way would be to say, well, this feeling that it's not comfortable, that is simply a feeling of alienation. Another way would be to say that self-ambiguity is a form of alienation. So Schroeder and Opali in a 1999 paper, they criticized the work of Harry Frankfurt, and they said that we should have a very broad construal of alienation, where anything that is not fully internalized is, in a sense, alien. And so similarly, if self-ambiguity is not the same as having an intrinsic moving principle, then that means automatically that it is alien. We can also make the example in analogy with authenticity, where you could say that anything that is not authentic is thus inauthentic. But again, I think that this sort of reintroduces the dichotomous framework. And what I've been arguing is that this means that we then leave something out. It leaves us with a less fine-grained account of human experience. Now, finally, we can, and I think this is the most promising route, is to say that alienation is different from self-ambiguity in terms of dynamics. So there's basically three ways in which, three possibilities, I would say. So the first one is that an action was previously experienced as internal and is now ambiguous. The second is that an action was previously experienced as external and now is ambiguous, or that an action was not previously experienced, but when it is experienced, it's immediately ambiguous. And I would say that alienation is, or at least, my limited knowledge of the literature on alienation, is that it tends to be interested in the first type of case, where something used to be internal, but has now either become external or maybe ambiguous. So I think that research on alienation is only relevant to the first type of case, and maybe not even completely. But I don't think that alienation is typically interested in the second and third type of case. Okay, so the final remark that I wanted to make is about process versus outcome. And I think that this has to do with the fact that some fields tend to be more interested in the outcome of certain processes than the processes themselves. So I think that a lot of research on authenticity and illness identity, for instance, investigates, let's say, successful cases or cases in which people have established an illness identity. And I think that doing so means missing out on agential self-ambiguity, because this most likely occurs in the process of establishing an illness identity, right? So if someone has successfully established an illness identity, then they may have already resolved some of the ambiguity. But the process itself, the ambiguity might still emerge. And I think this also goes for the case of transformative experiences that Paul has written an interesting book about, which are cases where people also have the intuition that they change both personally and epistemically. And I think that in this process of transformation, self-ambiguity also plays an important role. So to conclude, I've distinguished two forms of self-ambiguity. Identity-related self-ambiguity has been studied to some extent, but could benefit from this kind of integrated framework that I've been developing. First of all, to distinguish it more clearly from adjacent phenomena, but also to elucidate the agential processes leading to a particular identity-related outcome. Self-ambiguity, agential self-ambiguity, is neglected in existing research and is distinct from adjacent concepts like alienation and ambivalence. And this is a bit of an obvious conclusion, which is that much more conceptual work has to be done, but also empirical and methodological work remains to be done. And with respect to the latter, I think that it would be very interesting to reinterpret some of the existing data on, for instance, alienation and authenticity, to see if we can still find these cases of self-ambiguity in there, using this novel concept to reinterpret all data. Second, I think that we have to revise some of the measurement scales, so what we see in social psychology, for instance, but also in research on measuring how people deal with their illness, is again this dichotomous view, and as I've argued, that is insufficient. And finally, of course, we have to develop novel methods to investigate this. Okay, thank you for your attention. I've listed some of the papers here that I've written about self-ambiguity. So if you're interested in those, let me know and I can send them to you.